Hello, I'm Pastor Charles, and thanks for allowing me to come into your living room, family room, or if you're at a coffee house or a restaurant. We're excited about sharing with you each weekend a couple of insights for your life group. We're focusing on John chapter 15 and Jesus' powerful words when we talk about Him being the vine and us being the branches. That John 15 is in what we call the farewell passages of the Bible. The farewell passages in the Gospel of John begin at chapter 13, 14, and 15. And in these farewell passages, Jesus is actually trying to prepare His disciples for His eventual cross, when He's crucified, and then His departure, His ascension after His resurrection. So that's why most scholars call it the farewell passages. And in particular, there are two things we're going to focus on today that actually come from the plain truth, if you've had a chance to hear the message from this past weekend. And that is that Jesus prunes us so we can have maturity in our life and so we can bear fruit. Two primary things. Let's talk about maturity. We don't start out mature. Maturity is a process, isn't it? You start out as a child, you have baby food, and eventually you begin to eat solid food. And so it is with us spiritually. When we move from milk, as Paul says in the Gospels, to having solid food, it's because we've begun to mature as followers of Christ. What happens a lot of times is people get stuck. They get stuck in their spiritual growth. They get comfortable. In other words, they want to be fed instead of feeding themselves. And Jesus is saying, I want you to abide in me. I want you to remain in me, because if you do that, you'll be able to have maturity, growth, if you will, in your life. You'll mature. And we'll also mature when we learn to read the Scriptures ourselves. Now, Life Group is a place for us to read the Scriptures in the presence of one another, but also to digest the Scriptures into our lives. So we can then say in the Life Group, okay, what's the actual meaning? Each weekend, you're supposed to be reading questions for the study, which says on a scale of 1 to 10, what are you going to do about your own maturity? I'd like to ask you that now, even as we begin. What have you been doing in the last 2 or 3 months to mature yourself as a person, as a follower of God? Maturity comes when we exercise our muscles, when we exercise ourselves in service to others, daily Bible study and prayer, when we're willing to go outside of our own comfort zone. Jesus said, if you abide in me, then He says you'll be able to bear much fruit. That takes us to the second one, and that is to be fruit bearers. When I preach in Ghana, West Africa over the years, I've done something on a regular basis. Plantain and banana trees are quite plentiful. Often I'll ask one of the workers in the village who's got a machete to help me get a banana tree, a tall banana tree, out from the woods, from the bush area. And they'll bring that in, and they're remarkable with these machetes. They can not only cut down a plantain tree or a banana tree, but then they can dig a sizable hole in the ground, and we'll bury that tree in the ground for the evening service. Later on that evening, I'll read from John 15, and we'll talk about the fact that if we abide in Jesus, remain in Him, He's the source of life. He's the life-giving source of the universe. And if we abide in Him, we'll bear much fruit. But He goes on to say, apart from me, you can do nothing. You're like a branch that's actually taken apart, and if it's apart from the vine or from the source of life, it will wither, and it's good for nothing than to be thrown away. So then I asked the gentleman who helped me bring the tree in if I could borrow his machete. And I'll read those verses that apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. And I'll say, with this tree and on the branches, it'll eventually bear plantain. It'll bear bananas if it's a banana tree. And then I'll take the branch and I'll cut it off with the machete, and I'll hold the branch out and say, what happens to this branch when we throw it away? And you'll hear some of them in Twi or some of them in English say, it dies. It's good for nothing. It dies. It withers. And I said, that's true for us. You see, the entire Gospel of John is built upon one primary premise. In Jesus Christ, we have life. Apart from Jesus Christ, there's death. Because if He's the life-giving source of the universe, if He's the one that has power and love and all things that are good in Him, and we're apart from that, that is death. So Jesus says, abide in me, and my teachings, let my teachings be in your heart. And if you'll abide in me, He said, you'll bear much fruit. Now, what's the ultimate fruit bearing? The ultimate fruit bearing is love. Years ago, my professor, Dr. George Morris, had done a 3-month sabbatical up in the hills of Appalachia. When he was up in the hills, he wanted to go around and just visit the people, and he wanted to get to know them and what their needs were. Well, while he was there, a couple pastors wanted him to preach in their churches. So he preached a series of revivals one week at a Methodist church, and then the next week he went out and started knocking on doors and visiting with people. He knocked on one door, and a great big mountaineer, the guy must have been 6'6", just stood and filled in the door. Dr. Morris says he was shocked when the man says, "Hello, Brother Morris, come on in." And he says, "You know me?" And he says, "Yes." He said, "I was in the revival with you last week. I heard you preach. And I've heard you come up here to do your sabbatical work." Dr. Morris says, "That's right." And he says, "I've got one question for you. Have you come to study us?" He says, "I don't know quite what you mean." He says, "The government sends people up here all the time to study us. They want to know about our dental hygiene. They want to know about our poverty and how we're making it in the world. And universities come up and they come to study us, and they want to know how much brokenness we have and alcoholism we have." He said, "Dr. Morris, we don't need studying. We need loving." And George says he looked up at him and said, "I've come to love you. And you've just reminded me the most important thing we can do for one another is not to judge each other, not to condemn each other, but to love each other." So I'm going to ask you this coming week, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing in bearing fruit for God's kingdom? And particularly, how are you doing at loving other people, especially those who might be unlovable? Now I'll turn you back over to your group leader.